We are now streaming live on YouTube, so we can go ahead and get the meeting started.
Okay, thank you, Craig. This is Jim Getz. I'm the chair of the Park Board's Investment Committee and calling this meeting of the committee to order today, May 5th at 3:03 p.m. The entire committee, those of the committee that are present with us are Kevin Flynn, Steve Pullman, and Craig Sherman. And we will go to the order of business, the first of which is approval of the March 24, 2021 meeting minutes. Have you guys had a chance to look at them? Are there any changes, corrections?
Motion to approve.
I will second.
Motion and second. All those in favor say aye.
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 There's John.
Sorry to keep everybody waiting.
Thank you, John. How are you?
Very fine, thank you.
John, we just went live and there was a motion that was made and seconded to accept the March 24 minutes.
Thank you.
And if you would like to vote, if you move to approve, say aye. Okay,
Aye.
with that, with the John Nyer joining us, the also member of the investment committee. John, we are live on YouTube as well for our host of fans who do turn in every month for our meetings. So I'll just say we have now approved unanimously the minutes of March 24, and we'll move right into the first quarter 2021 performance report. So Craig, you want to walk us through the good news?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jim. And I do want to identify there has been an update to this report from the first one that's sent out, and additional formula checkpoints were inputted into this report. So going forward, we shouldn't see any issues with some of the numbers. The vol and gainer had some numbers off a little bit, so that has been updated to reflect what was sent over by them. So
But the numbers, the reports we have here, though, are the correct ones, right?
they are correct.
Yeah.
Yes, they are correct.
Thank you. Thank you.
So for the U.S. Bank, you do want to look at their benchmarks, and something we are going to discuss a little later is the benchmarks, but they were off for the first quarter. And I do have a question out to U.S. Bank to explain why they were off roughly about 70 basis points from their benchmark. So once I have that information from U.S. Bank, I'll be sharing that with the investment committee. And this is one where they originally did send incorrect information over for the performance report, and they went ahead and updated their information. So it was correctly reflective of the quarter. So I'll once I have information on how they performed versus their benchmark, why there's a variance, I'll share that. For vol and gainer, they exceeded expectations. If you look at the benchmark, it was around 4.55 for the first quarter, and they were at 5.57. Going on to PNC, they did match what their benchmark is, 2.73, with actual first quarter of 2.74. Unfortunately, with their benchmark, they are lower than U.S. Bank and Fifth Third Bank's benchmark, which uses the same formula. This is going to change in the next quarter. They will be moving towards that benchmark that's going to be uniform between U.S. Bank, PNC, and Fifth Third.
And
So
Craig, just as a point of reference, we provided those numbers to them at our last meeting, correct?
Yes. So, and that new investment policy is implemented. And in the next quarter, the new benchmarks will be reflected in this report.
And, well, go ahead and finish and then we can talk about it.
Then Fifth Third Bank, they came pretty close to the benchmark, off 10 basis points. You can see where they came in at 4.3, 4.3 for the first quarter and year to date.
So I guess my frustration is number one, why their benchmark is so much lower. But I guess more so, it just seems like the opportunity to have beaten that benchmark in this past quarter seems like the opportunity was there.
Yes, for US Bank, absolutely. And for PNC, it's for us is getting them on the same playing field so they can no longer kind of have that excuse of, well, they have different IPS.
Okay.
Yeah, PNC Bank, even though they matched their benchmark, that's the one that identified it. It didn't. It's unfortunate that's so low.
Craig, I had a question about the U.S. Bank portfolio and maybe refresh my memory, but in theory, why would the Drabner fund return, a half a point less than Fleischman? Aren't those all? I mean, aren't they virtually identical the way U.S. Bank would invest? Or this seems a little bit of deja vu, like maybe we've talked about it before, but why aren't they identical? Like, why don't they, kind of stack up the way the Fifth Third portfolio does, for example?
And that's something I can follow up with them to understand why there is difference from investing from Grabner to Fleshman. Then you go down to the Fleshman Gardens, that's nearly 3 million,
Yeah.
performing at a higher rate.
Yeah, I mean, it's not dramatic, but a half a point is real, and it's just surprising because I would think that they'd be invested almost identically, if not identically.
Yeah, I thought that they have said that to us because I thought the last time we went through this, they said, well, let's just go through one because the others are pretty much invested the same way. So we didn't go through detail of every single fund.
Did
That
we
is
do
a quite-
rebalancing in the last quarter, which would have had an impact on timing of sales, which could be, even if you did it on the same week, you could have a few points there. Didn't we do some rebalancing in the last quarter?
I bet they do almost every quarter, and I think that's a valid point, in which it'll smooth out over time for sure, but the timing of a week, a day here or there could potentially do this. Because if you look at the annual performance, it tightens up a great deal. Although, heck, there's even still wiggle room there.
Yeah. Craig, that might be a good question. And it would concern me because I think as far as fees, I think they could roll this all together. They're not basing fees based on each individual fund. So the fact that one is smaller than the other should not impact the fee percentage paid. So, yeah, I think a question is warranted for them for that, just to make sure that is the fees are not different, and also that let them explain, because even as you're right, a half point can be significant at these balances.
Yeah.
And I think we should definitely go on record that we'll review the PNC closely again at the end of the next quarter based on having met with them and given them the same investment criteria and that the others are using.
Yes, I anticipate that the 3 month should be in line with the other with U.S. Bank and Fifth Third investment managers. The year date would be off a little bit just because the first quarter they did use that different.
Yep.
And I do want to point out, I had a conversation with Jamie Carr with Fifth Third Bank about fees. they will be lowering our fees at Fifth Third Bank. And once I have details around that, I'll share that information.
That's great news.
Helps to ask, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Once we get that in writing, we'll contact US Bank and PNC and have a discussion with them.
Yep.
If you,
Exactly. Once I get it in writing, they committed to it, but I need to see it in writing.
Yeah, and stuff like that, Craig, as you get it throughout the month or whatever, you don't necessarily have to wait for a next meeting, but if you want to shoot the committee updates throughout the month or between meetings, that'd be great.
Great. Yeah, absolutely.
Any other observations, comments, reflections on first quarter?
I'm looking forward to continued growth.
Yeah, second quarter has kept going, so this is good. Okay, Craig, let's keep rolling here then. Then distribution recommendation.
The next part was going to be, let me go back to the agenda, benchmark review. So one of the
I'm
things
sorry,
that I know John mentioned was just getting everybody on the same playing field. So even with, if you look back at the performance report, the benchmarks were slightly different between US Bank and Fifth Third Bank, even though they're using the same formula for their benchmarks, same indexes. So on the second page, what I was thinking is, would it be good or prudent for us to move towards where we're inputting the benchmarks versus obtaining them from the investment managers, and then they're just providing us, well, they'll provide us their benchmarks, but then they'll provide us their actual performance. So it puts everybody on the same playing field, because even though they're indicating they're using the same indexes, obviously there is a little variation between there. When you look at US Bank and Fifth Third, then we're going to throw PNC in the mix. Do we want to have 3 different benchmarks that are pretty similar, or do we want to just go ahead and just calculate the benchmarks ourselves and then have a stagnant benchmark for all 3?
Well, Craig, I assume on the schedule that you gave us here, we're at the top, you've got benchmark on Vanguard. What are these the benchmarks that we have provided to them, or are these what are actually being used, or what tell us what this is?
This is the information. So when I reached out to US Bank and Bond Gainer and the Fifth Third Bank, they shared what their benchmark calculations were. Fifth Third Bank and US Bank used the same benchmark calculations. So they both use the S&P at 40, the SP 400 at 10, the Russell 2000 at 10, the MCI at 10, and Bloomberg Barclays at 30. So each of them use the same calculation for their benchmarks.
And we have now shared that with PNC, these
Yes.
same benchmarks. Okay. I think we should continue the way you're reporting it now, where you're pulling, and then that way we can see if for some reason they are differing on their benchmark and ask them why. So I see that Fifth Third was exactly what you had, and US Bank was instead of 4.4, they were 4.35.
All of them were pretty close.
Yeah,
on that one.
Yeah. I think you should continue doing it the way that you are, where if they've reported to you a benchmark of 4.35, go ahead and put it on the report like that. And then we can use that to sort of know if there's a question we need to ask them, if for some reason it's significantly different than what we were expecting.
The only challenge I might suggest, you're not contemplating putting Ball and Gainer under the same benchmark, and that their philosophy with the dividend, their investing model is different. So you wouldn't plan the same benchmark for them, but the others who have a similar investment directive from us would have identical benchmarks then.
Yes.
Thank
Yeah, I
you.
think that's exactly right, John.
And
And,
just
and that's what you're reflecting for Ball and Gainer on that schedule, the area below where the Ball and Gainer benchmark for the first 3 months would have been 4.56 versus the 4.4 that we have for the other players.
And as a comparison tool, the uniformity of the benchmark is much more important than whatever the specific is. If you're looking at the effectiveness of different managers with a similar charge, I won't say it doesn't matter which benchmark you use, but as long as you use a consistent one, that your use is your need is met by that. So I think that would be a good continuation.
Yeah, yeah. So Craig, we should confirm again in writing or whatever, or just be sure that both Fifth Third and US Bank, it sounds like we've already confirmed here that we are using the same numbers. We need to confirm with PNC that they have these same benchmarks that we will be using to assess their performance.
Yeah, I'll follow up again with Terry because I shared all this information with him to make sure that they are using these for their benchmarks. And information from Fifth Third and US Bank came directly from them with calculations.
Okay. And as I said, the way that you've reported it here, I think just continue doing it that way so that we can see if there's a question with what they thought the benchmark was. Okay. I think the
Sounds
question
good.
you asked was, should we be using their benchmarks that they're providing to us, or just plug into this schedule this number that you've calculated? Was that your question?
Yes.
Okay, as long as you give us, or you provide to us your calculated benchmark for the quarter, just like you've done here today, we can verify that they're basically playing from the same playbook.
Yeah, just look for uniformity there. This way we know what they're stating. And that's why with that exercise, just reviewing their benchmark does match our calculations on our side.
Okay.
You know,
This-
Craig, everything's really tight for the first quarter. You get a little bit more variance as you go to 1 and 3 and 5 years. Are you confident? Are they apples to apples? Is everything either gross of fees or net of fees on both pages?
I would have to go back up with the Vanguard.
I can tell you, and Jim knows we're with US Bank. Every time I try to do this with them, I get similar results to what you have here in front of us. And the math is always different. And I'm always told that I've oversimplified or overweighted, and they have undersimplified or underweighted. And I can never get it to come back. But so I'm surprised that the first quarter is, almost dead to nuts. And then you do get a little bit of swing as you go out. But I think this is great information.
Agreed. Any other comments for Craig or suggestions on this topic? Great. Thank you for that review, Craig. Distribution recommendation. You want to walk us through this, Craig?
Yeah, so for the distribution recommendations, I know right now, Commissioner, yes, we do not have a budget yet for the Commissioner's funds, but we do want to kind of look at distribution. So I do know with the 4 funds below, there will be a distribution for those. But let's walk through. So the top funds, Miles Edwards, Geyer, Fleshman Gardens, Levy Clock, Grabner, and Bettman, those are funds that we traditionally were able to take a 1 to 5% distribution. on the 20 trailing quarters. So each of those funds, you can see the 1%, a 2%, a 3%, a 4%, and that 5% distribution for each of those funds. Then the bottom one, that's the 5% distribution. So that's where the actual, especially with Fifth Third Bank, the trustee it's a 5% the way it's set up, the trust is. It's a 5% distribution no matter what. So you're looking at the Meyer Fund, Fountain Square, Hawk Fountain Square, Salt City, and Fleshman, the lesser of the Fleshman, at a 5% distribution of $416,943. There may be a slight variance when we truly get the distribution amount from Fifth Third Bank and U.S. Bank. U.S. Bank holds the Fleshman, but it should be fairly close.
So a couple things. With regard to the quote automatic 5% distribution that we're looking at the bottom set of funds here. These are the ones that we are not the trustee. And in our review of all of the funds with our outside attorney, he said that he agreed with their tax classification for these funds and agreed that this 5% distribution is appropriate. So from that standpoint, I think as Craig has shown it here, we will be getting the 5% distribution for these funds. What we need to do is recommend to the board, the park board, on the top funds here, should we recommend a 2%, 3%, 4%, or 5% distribution right now? And let me preface this with the fact that just as we did last year, where we said we would distribute 3%, was it 3 or 2% last year, Craig?
It is 2.5.
Yeah, it was less than 3, I think. And we
It
said
was.
that we would look at it near the end of the year to determine if we needed more, because we're not tied to just one annual declaration or distribution. So having said that, I would recommend for budgeting purpose that we stick with a 3% distribution for budgeting purposes, which is what I think Craig is looking for right now. And the other reason why I say that is there could be a need that comes up that we would say, if there's something we needed to spend money on and we didn't have it appropriated, we can go back as a park board and say, okay, we only took 2% from the endowment funds in fiscal year 2020. Let's go back and take up to 5% as we were allowed to do for that. And we could do the same thing with this year. So you see where I'm going with this. My recommendation would be for budgeting purposes to budget at a lower number like the 3%, knowing that we have flexibility that if projects pop up that we need funds for, we can always suggest additional distributions. And you can see what we're talking about here is basically between 2% and 3% and 4%. We're talking about $100,000 no matter which way you go. So if it's 2, 3, or 4%, Craig's calculated it at about $100,000. And I just know, me personally, I lean towards budgeting conservatively and then always able to have available funds should we have a need to exceed budget. But
And that's something that definitely, we've seen this with like the Sudi Acres, where there was additional need throughout the year, where then we came back as an organization and asked for additional distribution amount.
What's your thoughts?
The only thing that I have to add to that, Jim, and I don't disagree with your analysis, but we do have kind of the commissioner's fund that's already been pulled out of these various trusts and is kind of sitting there as money to be spent as well. So when a need pops up, I think it's going to be a rare occasion that we're going to need to go back into these trusts and take more out of the trust, because we built up such an overfunding of the commissioner's fund over the years because projects haven't gotten completed or they haven't been budgeted for.
That's a good point, Kevin. And I'll also throw out that I have heard comments made by commissioners of, unless we're sure we're actually going to spend those dollars, I don't want to take them out of the endowment funds. Normally, I would agree with that. In the back of my mind, I keep thinking at where the Dow is sitting right now and where performance is right now. And is this a time to go ahead and take a little more, knowing that performance is extremely high? We're only talking about $100,000 here too. So it's not that 100,000 isn't real money, but so I guess in my mind, do we want to go 2% versus 3%? Which would, given the fact that from a commissioner's account, we still have approximately $7 million. And Craig, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's somewhere right around $7 million of distributed earnings that are available to be spent by the park board, but have not yet been spent. Some of that is due to spending restrictions, and some of it is just that we have not spent it.
Yes, we have 7.5 million.
7.5 million.
Yeah, the one PNC investment account keeps growing.
Keeps growing, that's correct. Well, to me, again, we're only talking, I think I might rethink and say 2% distribution then for budgeting purposes.
Based on what you just said, Jim, about the sense of the commissioners wanting to keep the funds in the endowment until we're going to use them, I'd rather see us use some of the funds in the commissioner's account, unless it is for a particular use for which the trust was set up. So if it is for the levy clock, then the funding should come out of the levy clock. But if we're using these funds for something other than because they're excess of what is needed for the maintenance of that particular item, then I think let's start spending on the, or at least committing to spend on the commissioner's fund and allow the endowments to grow.
So that would speak to more toward a 2%, which I'm certainly amenable to. I like the idea of some gains taking, so locking in some gains, but I believe our IPS allows for some accumulation of cash in the funds. And so if we wanted to do that, and I'm not necessarily suggesting we do, we could direct managers to, I wouldn't want to do it wholesale, but take 5%, 10% of gains and risk holding some cash for a period of time if we think that the market is not always only going to go in one direction. And I'm not sure we want to be that active in our funds. I'm really not, but it is appealing to lock in some gains a little bit, which a larger distribution does do.
Yeah, and that's the other point as well, is that we now has, as Craig mentioned, we do have a piece of the endowment, of the commissioner's funds invested with PNC in, I can't remember what is it 70-30 or what is the
60-40.
60-40? So the fact that we would take more, we have been using this is, stop me if I'm getting in the weeds here, guys, because it gets a little complicated. But as I said before, over the years, we take distribution from these endowment funds. That money then sits in what we call the Commissioner's Fund, which today is roughly 7.5 million. What we have done recently, or in the past several years, was because we haven't spent all of that money, rather than sitting in a checking account, we have right now just, we have over $4 million of that in a PNC account, interest bearing, earning at 60 equity, 40% investment. That's on your first sheet there. When you see PNC COM, COMM, that's the Commissioner's Fund. So when you see that $4 million, that is 4 million of the 7.5 million that is available, that's been distributed out of these sometimes restricted funds. So we do have the ability, Kevin, to take it and invest it there.
Jim, where is the rest of that 3.5 million then?
Then that is either sitting in a checking account, basically, or in an account at the city waiting to be spent.
So not part of our endowment anymore.
That's correct.
And did a lot of it get there via these 3 and 4 and 5% distributions that were unspent?
All of it was generated that way.
So to John's question, if our policy is up to 5%, can we really? Well, I guess you can sock away cash in theory, right? You distribute 5%, but you don't spend it all. You don't have a need for 5%. It goes into that Commissioner's Fund again, right?
Yeah, and it's basically being held in cash.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, do we, in terms of spending the Commissioner's Fund, who budgets that? At what level is that spend budgeted?
That, Craig, on an annual basis, here's the process. We go through a process where we budget the funds received from the city. So for example, if the city gives us $14 million, $15 million out of city allocated budget, that is budgeted by Craig and approved by the park board. Additionally, then we have set aside a budget that comes out of the Commissioner's Fund on an annual basis.
Mm-hmm.
Some of that is needed to augment the city's budget where there is a shortfall. But as Kevin indicated, we're sitting on $7.5 million of unspent distributed earnings. And then we will be adding to that whatever we pull out for the coming year.
So in theory, if we budgeted 2% instead of 4%, and we therefore needed 200K to balance after we got our allowance from the city, we would just take 200 from the Commissioner's Fund.
That's the balancing act Craig has to do. The difficulty comes in on restricted versus unrestricted.
Sure. Yeah.
That's the one thing that Craig always has to be looking at. But anytime we've got unrestricted funds available, and I think this is where Kevin was going, and I think the other park commissioners feel the same way. If there is unrestricted money sitting in that $7.5 million, let's be spending that down.
An example of that would be, so looking at the Miles Edwards Fund, I'm going to use that one for the example because that's one that we actually control the distribution amount here. Right now it's sitting at about 152,000 in its balance. So now if the expenses come out there later in this quarter, then obviously that'll decrease that balance, but it has a 152,000 in that balance. So if we distribute the 59, when we go to budget, if we're budgeting 100,000, then that 59,000 will be part of that 100,000, but then we can also retrieve from that outstanding balance sitting in the commissioner's fund with the city or at PNC Bank.
So as I think through the options here, the options are to take a higher percent with the understanding that then some of that could be held in cash with the park board or invested at a 60-40 earning facility at PNC. Or we can just distribute like a 2% number and leave the rest in these managed endowment funds. And then the option number 3 would be what we just said, take the 2%, leave the rest in the managed funds, but encourage them to take some profits if they thought we were being reasonable about that.
Encourage the managers to
Yeah.
take some profit, but leave the cash here. Don't take 5% and throw it in the commissioner's fund. Take our 2%, but you're telling the managers to do some profit taking and build up some cash. Is that the thought process?
Yeah.
So you've still left it in these accounts.
Yeah, and that's the question. Do we want to get into that's John's question too. Do we become even more active in managing these funds?
I would support, if we're going to take the larger, is moving it over to the PNC and keeping it in our money market account on PNC side versus on the investment manager side.
Yeah.
The only hesitation I have with that, is I think it was Kevin or Jim, somebody had said that the commissioners had indicated a lack of appetite for that. But if that could be managed through, if they could find comfort with that, I don't know that we do want to be in the business of saying sell now, buy now. I just don't think that's why you have managers, so that you don't have real estate people saying when you should buy and sell your stocks. So I get that, but so it's more of a commissioner's question, and Jim is the representative, and I don't know that we answered today. But if there is an openness or appetite to that, I could certainly support the idea of a little larger distribution, knowing that it will potentially sit in cash. And again, we're not talking about massive swings, but I'd be more in mind of that 4 from the first group and 5 from the second, and understanding that it's going to, and if markets don't rebalance and we end up shifting it to that PNC, we're not completely missing whatever gains that are there. But
Yeah.
that's more of a commissioner question than I think maybe this committee can answer on its own.
Here's where I think I would shake out right now after listening to this. Again, I think of what we are talking about right now more as a budgeting tool. And I think I would go back to my initial thought of distributing initially, declaring or suggesting that we declare take a 2% distribution, and that be built in the budgeting that Craig will do. which will, in a way, force him to continue to use down this 7.5 million where available to be used. I think we have in front of the park board, we will have some opportunities for additional spending, and I'll share with you one of those. Our mobile fleet of equipment, meaning trucks, trailers, and even I'll put power equipment like riding lawnmowers and all that stuff, is starting to age rapidly. And staff has started talking with the board about getting additional funds to replace some of that very dated equipment. I think I would advocate today for us to say we would recommend for budgetary purposes a 2% distribution. But then as the board, and I would have to make sure that the board is fully aware that we are at, you also saw the memo I wrote in February that said, guys, we've got a lot of earnings sitting here. There's a lot of availability. Well, that's only compounded, as we all know now, over the past several months. So I know that at this coming board meeting, and we're talking about with that equipment, we could be talking about over the next couple years, like $1 million, $1.5 million, maybe even up to $2 million needed to get newer equipment. I think I would then say, okay, board, if that's something you want to do, then as a finance committee, we recommend, here's a place that you can get it. We would recommend that you take an additional amount of money out of the restricted funds or the endowment funds to fund some of that at this time.
Two other factors coming into this. One is the additional federal government funding that's coming to the city, that's been committed to the city, for which a lot of is uncommitted at this point. The individual council members have not put forth their proposals. The mayor, even though the mayor, had a series of press conferences where he was proposing spending, he was only proposing spending about 30 million of that 168 million that we get in this coming fiscal year. So that's part one. Part two is we finally have an objective third-party report that tells us where our park hard assets are in poor condition, okay condition, etc., where we're not guessing at where we need to replace or repair things. So there's finally an opportunity to objectively spend some of this commissioner's money as well.
And Kevin, I want to get into that a little bit more in the next segment here, but if we could wrap up this as it relates to the.
I'd second your proposal of doing the 2% at this point, just because we have so much in the commissioner's fund right now.
I agree.
I could support that as well. That's perfectly fine by me.
Okay. Well, so Craig, let's, we will make a note, and I don't know if are you doing commissioner's budget this meeting in April? Or are you doing that in May? Or are you doing that in June?
That's going to be in June or July.
Okay, so at some point, I'm meeting with Kara tomorrow, talking about the agenda for the May meeting. But at this point, we will take out of this meeting then a recommendation by the Finance Committee to the Park Board that they take a 2% distribution from the funds in which we are the trustees for budgetary purposes. And we'll, as we report to the board, we will also share these same type of comments that we've made here, where we have seen significant growth in these funds. And if there are funding needs, that it becomes another source of capital or a source of funds should we need those for projects going forward. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Well, so I'm going to move into discussing outstanding items, and we'll come back to the trust review, because I want to continue to pick up what Kevin just said here. As you've all read in the papers, there is the CARES Act funding from the federal government. And it's looking like the city of Cincinnati will get somewhere in the neighborhood of $290 to $300 million over the next 2 years. Right now, I'm not exactly sure how much of that will be in year 1 versus year 2. So we are right in the middle of a process where city government is trying to determine how best to spend those funds. What has happened to date, as Kevin just said, was the mayor has gone through and made some recommendations on places to spend some of that money. I will say that some good things. Part of that, number one, would be to give to the departments who have like enterprise funds or revenue funds. So for example, parks. Crone Conservatory has been closed now for over a year. So for our budget, out of the Crone Fund, we lost revenues, and Craig's got the number, but in excess of $500,000 of just lost revenues for Crone. So one of the first things, in the same way with CRC, Recreation Commission, they've been closed. They have not gotten revenue for golf courses, for people coming in and using the facilities. We had a restricted pool season last year. So revenues that typically come into city departments to cover expenses, because all of our expenses are not variable, we've had to draw down on restricted funds. So we've been eating reserves for the past year because of lost revenues. I was very, very happy to see that the mayor and city manager recommended first that we take some of that money and offset the lost revenues in accounts like that for the park board, for the health departments, for CRC. So we will be getting back some money first out of this to replenish our restricted funds that we've tapped into. The mayor and city manager then also came up with projects that they felt were worthy of some of this money. And I want to give you a sense of that, that for the parks, he's recommended $1 million to go into tree canopy. So into replacing street trees, an additional $1 million out of these funds to generate for our urban forestry department to work on tree canopy. We've also got investments in here recommended by the city manager for trail expansion in many of our parks, such as, parks throughout the city of 2.7 million. We've got specifically some trail work to be done in Mount Airy, and tying in trails from Mount Airy to several of our other parks, since Mount Airy is somewhat centered and touches, there's areas that it could connect. So we would look at, there's been proposed $5 million for that. There's a proposal for a new park in front of the Underground Railroad Center Museum. So there's a recommendation for $3 million of funding for that. An additional $1.5 million for completion of Smale Riverfront Park, the new music venue. We did a phase 1 that we had funds for. The Park Foundation has continued raising money to finish out the phase 2 with all of the finishes and everything that we had hoped for in that park. So we now have gotten an additional 1.5 proposed from the city. And then staff provided the city with a list of $1 million of what they called shovel-ready projects that are ready to go. We were just waiting on funding for it. So that totals up to $14 million in projects and additional $2.4 million of replaced revenue loss, so to speak. So it's about $16.8 million that the city manager and mayor have recommended to come to parks out of that funding. We have, since that time, reached out, going back to what Kevin has talked about, that we also have a third-party analysis that's done of all of our parks, park by park by park, facility by facility, that we now see that we have $70-some million that will be estimated to be needed to be spent in the next 5 to 6 years. Of that amount, I just happen to have the numbers here, 14.6 million was identified as being in poor condition, which means either from a safety standpoint or very deteriorated, but 14.6 million was called poor by the consultant, saying, you need to do something in the next year or that 14.6 will continue to grow. Plus, it's just, some of it is just unsafe things in parks that need to be fixed. So we have, since that proposal by the mayor and city manager, we've put in an additional request to each of the city council people for 14.6 million more dollars out of that federal funds to go towards these poor projects, the projects identified as poor. Just so you know, poor was 14.6, and the fair, which is the next category, was an additional $36 million. So you see that of that 74 some million dollars, 36 and 14, so 50 million of that 74, they're saying really needs to be done in the next 1 to 3 years. So rather than asking for 36 million out of this federal funding on top of the 16 that was already somewhat identified, we made a specific request for the 14.6 to cover the poor conditioned items. So that's still pending and it's up to city council. We have also requested of the city council people in that same request, besides the 14.6, we've also asked for $4 million to go towards Smale Riverfront Park Lot 28. That's the last piece of Smale Riverfront Park that has not been, that will have not been completed after the music venue is done. So there is no funding right now identified for that. The Parks Foundation continues to raise money for that. we're anticipating, the last that I saw from Steve Schuckman was that could be another $6 million that's needed to finish lot 28. So we've asked for 4 million for that. That's the ask. Obviously, everybody is making asks right now. So we wanted to get that out there for a couple reasons. Number one, to stress with City Council that you have owned assets here that are our property that we own, that we have up to 70-some million dollars of potential repairs needed within the next 5 years. And as you all know, we have been getting on an annual basis closer to $2 million a year in capital, which is funding things that come up. And Steve Schuckman has been doing a good job of trying to see where it's a safety issue in the parks, that gets capital funding pretty quickly. But as you can imagine, that capital funding at 2 million a year is not going to cut the need for the 70 million. So in my thinking, the purpose was twofold. Number one, there's availability of funds here. I wanted to try and get a significant amount of money to go towards these. And then number two, just to bring that whole issue in front of the council people one more time so that they are aware of what we're talking about. So that was a long-winded story, but that tells you it's a very, very, it's a very big dynamic that's going on in the city right now with what to do with these funds. I also am very pleased that city management, meaning mayor and city council and the city manager are looking at some of these funds to shore up budget deficits for the next couple of years at least, and also looking at where other restricted funds have been depleted over the past few years to shore those up as well. So I feel like as a park board, you guys are our financial people. I think we've done a good job of putting our ask out there. I was thrilled with the 16.8 that came out from the city manager and mayor in their initial proposals. And we went back with an additional 18.6 on top of it of ask to throw our hat in the ring because it's legitimate funding needs for us.
And Jim, just as a former council person, you know, one of the buzz phrases that was always used down there when they were talking about funding things is, well, we're leveraging our city dollars. And that's where I think perhaps some of the money in the commissioner's fund, we could use that to leverage some of the ask. So we're saying, hey, a hard number of facilities in poor, dangerous conditions of $14 million. You don't want to give us the whole 14, give us 12 of it and we'll raise the other 2, and then we write the 2 out of the commissioner's fund.
That's an excellent point, Kevin. And that second ask just went out a couple days ago with a note that I am following up with each city council person, and Kara and I will talk with them. And I think that is an excellent point that I will be sure that we bring up to them. And in a way, we're sort of saying that as well, that, you know, there's a lot of things that are on this list, and things like the equipment that we have that is over 10 years old. The total that we need for all those projects are, I believe, Craig, close to $3 million, if I'm not mistaken, that over the next 3 years, we could put $3 million to use of bringing our our equipment up to standards. So that's an excellent point, Kevin. I'm glad you made that we should be also, as we're talking to council, saying that we intend to also leverage our funds to do this. And I know that members of the Parks Foundation is reaching out to council people as well, saying the same thing, that for things like Lot 28, if you will provide 2 million, we'll come up with 2 million, you know, that sort of thing. So that's exactly what you're talking about, Kevin, but that's a great point. And I bring why this is also important for what we're talking about here is the whole concept of how quickly can we spend the commissioners fund money. And with knowing that we have 16.8, and again, I'll also, just for your information, the exact guidelines for how those funds can be spent have not been issued yet by the federal government. Federal government has said you're going to get $290 to $300 million, and we'll tell you how you can spend it, and we haven't gotten that yet. So a lot of this is being done at the moment with the understanding that if qualified, here's how we would like to spend it. So that's probably all more information than either of you would ever want to know, but that's where we are with this whole 200 and some million dollars.
And Jim, I would just encourage you when you're meeting with the city council people and they start pushing back saying we don't have the guidelines yet, because I've heard that in the paper from council members that we don't want to make proposals for spending this money until we have the guidelines. My suggestion is ask them to get out in front of it and ask that the solicitor's office draft the ordinance with that exact provision that you said, if allowable under the final rules and regulations promulgated by the federal government. We saw that with the PPP loans or whatever they were, that the guidelines were changing almost daily on these forgivable loans that came out in the first set of fundings. That I know a lot of the nonprofits that I worked with were like, you know, we're ready to apply for forgiveness, but the rules that we prepared our application for forgiveness changed 3 times since we started doing it. So encourage them to get out in front of it and just put the caveat in there that in the ordinance that the money will not be spent until the rules allow it to be spent.
I was feeling relatively calm and peaceful till you brought that subject up.
Well, you know, it's I am going to continue pushing and being vocal about really identifying these are our owned assets. The city owns these already. I don't think there's been anything proposed by the mayor or any of the other council people that are not worthy causes. But with X number of finite dollars, I want to stress making sure we take care of our own property first. And CRC did the same thing, just so I'm on the CRC board as well. CRC was allocated or identified something similar, like 16-some million dollars that the mayor and city manager had come up with earmarked for CRC things like opening up more of the pools this summer, extending hours at the pool, making CRC whole for lost revenues over the past couple of years. CRC also went back and said, here's an additional, I think that number was $9.5 million. Here's an additional $9.5 million. We have this facility, and this facility that needs new roofs. We need, so they went back with the same type of concept of, thank you for what you're offering. If there's money available, we have some of your assets that need to be attended to. So that's going to be at least my mantra, and I know there's a few other people that will be pushing this concept of making sure we take care of our owned assets.
Jim, when did you say you'll have a gut feel about whether it's 12 or 14 or 16? What is that timing?
Well, we don't know. And in fact, to Kevin's point, the city manager and mayor are being proactive, and there are ordinances that will be coming to city council. Is today Wednesday? That
Yeah.
went to city council as we speak, doing exactly what Kevin said, so that it will be within the next few months, for sure, because there's two tranches of money that's coming, and there will be a deadline for when that has to be spent by. And it's going to be a short fuse, because the whole thing is intended to spur economic and recovery from the pandemic and all the implications that we've felt because of it. So, Steve, the answer is we're going to know real soon.
Good.
And under government time, real soon is 90 days. Kevin, am I being fair there?
Yeah, I would just add that the city's budget gets finalized by June 30th of this year.
Yeah,
I
so
would expect that all of those asks would be included in that, even if there aren't final guidelines from the federal government.
I think you're absolutely right, Kevin. I think the concept was that the same process that the city government's going through in a typical budgeting process where everybody is submitting needs and all of that sort of thing. There's a parallel path here where they are having open house, what do they call, where they have open house. I'll call it open house, but it's not.
Public hearings. Or,
Public forums and public input sessions to get all of these together so that then the 9 people and mayor can work together to hash out, here's a budget then for those funds, and make sure that here's year 1 and year 2. So that's all outside. That's, as I said, running parallel with a normal budgeting process that we went through. The good news in all of this is that when we were going through the normal annual budgeting process, there was an anticipated shortfall in the city's budget, which would then trickle down so that Parks was asked, if you had to cut your budget by 15%, tell us how you would do it. So we're hoping that, and the full anticipation is, if allowed under these guidelines, whenever they come forward, is that funds would be used out of this stimulus money to be able to make the city budget whole, so that we would not be dealing with budget cuts from the normal city budget. So we would have a full budget from the city, then on top of that, have these additional funds for projects and that we'd be looking for. So it's a very, very good story. And we're just hoping that the guidelines that come out are not too restrictive as to use for those funds.
Well, and Jim, just to follow up on that, the city did the same thing last year and made us cut they came out after the pandemic started and said, we've got to cut, I don't know, Craig, was it 10% or 15% out of the budget? So that's when there were, the ERIPs, the early retirements came into play, and we lost a lot of experience in the Parks Department particularly.
Well, and on top of that, Kevin, a lot of the ways that we were fortunate at the park board to be able to plug those cuts utilizing our restricted funds, our reserves, basically. But some of those restricted funds got pretty depleted. You think of Crone especially, or our Riverfront Park, 329 or 318, whatever the number is, the account number, where usually we were getting a lot of money in for people using the facilities. We got none of that, but we fortunately didn't fire a bunch of people to plug the budget. So fortunately with this money, we're hoping, and the city intends to, as I said, replenish some of those depleted funds out of this money if that's available. So that's probably a whole lot more but it just gives you guys a sense for what's going on. It's good news. It's good news for parks right now. I think it sure beats still having a 20 million hole in the city's operating budget for the year. It sure beats us trying to scramble to find funds. The stock market performance has helped. So all this means is that Craig's got an extremely easy job at the moment, and is just has a lot of options here as far as funding opportunities. But that sort of gives you guys a picture into the extremely important topics that are being kicked around right now that impact the parks. On top of that, just a couple quick things. We're going to have the Riverfront, the music center and the music facility park, the music venue park, will be having an opening. We'll be doing a ribbon cutting soon. I think that's set to come online perhaps by the end of May, maybe beginning of June. There's nothing booked in there yet this year. There are bookings already for both the indoor facility and the park. So we've already got some things lined up for those facilities, but it will be done fairly quickly. We're doing a tour. The park board is doing a tour tomorrow of it. It looks fantastic. I was blown away when I was down there the other day of the progress that's been made. We're looking at a lot of other projects going on. Tom Jones Commons in Eden Park is about to have a ribbon cutting in June. There's a lot of work being done at Inwood Park in Mount Auburn. We've got projects that are going on in Burnett Woods. Lots of going on in Mount Airy. We're having a beginner's skills learning course developed for mountain biking as part of Mount Airy Forest, in a section of Mount Airy that's been somewhat cordoned off to the public, or at least to cars, because there's not been a lot of activity. So this is a way that will activate a big one of the whole areas at Mount Airy. And along with CORA, which is the Cincinnati Off-Road Alliance, who's raising a lot of money for this, Park Board is chipping in some of our funds, again, like out of our capital budgets or out of the Commissioner's Fund, to redo the pavilion there, redo the restrooms there, so that it's this beginner skill bike course is sort of a catalyst for improving that whole park. So there's a lot going on in the parks. Our challenge will be to have the manpower resources to be able to pull off this amount of spending over the next couple of years. So we're focused on that as well. But that's sort of an update on where we are with just park things. Craig, is there anything else or any questions you guys might have?
You covered the major project, and yes, it is a little bit, hopefully a sigh of relief for the next couple of years. We don't have to identify cuts. So it is definitely something I'm looking forward to.
But long term,
5 hours a week, just bored, I guess.
Yeah.
well, somebody's got to write the checks, you know, John. So yeah, it keeps them busy. But you know, it does with. I mean, the good news, bad news is that we just got this report that is in such detail. It was such a fine job done by this consulting firm that it really points out, as that we talked about earlier, 70-some million dollars of repairs over the next 5 years. We've sort of have a little money now that plugs, perhaps helps with that, but it may mask a little bit the long-term need for some dedicated funding for parks and recreation at the same time. So we'll continue talking about that with city government as well. Craig, is there anything else that was on our agenda that we need to hit, or have I successfully gone out of order enough? Oh, update on trust reviews. I still owe you all some detail on that. As I said, we've got most of that wrapped up now. Good news is that we will have a book that we will have, and I'll make sure each of you have a copy of it, but we will have a page in there for each of our endowment funds, all the specifics about those, the characteristics of them. We're going to do some cleanup work here. There's some tax ID numbers that are wrong on a couple of these accounts, so we need to correct those. John, you'll love this. One of these endowment funds, and I'm blanking which one, has the Parks Foundation's tax ID number on it. So just some little things like that that have come up as we're cleaning through this. The other thing that we are going to be discussing with the park board too, and we'll discuss it here maybe next meeting, is a couple of our restricted funds that are restricted for a specific park. Do we want to go through the process of appealing to family members, descendants, to say, can we amend those agreements to mirror what we've done with a couple other ones, which are, as long as we first take care of this park, can we then use excess earnings for like type of park maintenance in other parks? So that's something where we've identified in this whole process that might be another next step. But we'll put something on that. We'll put that back on the next agenda, Craig, to talk more specifically about. So we're at an hour 20 right now. Any other topics, questions, comments? Guys, I really appreciate it, and sorry to perhaps go into more detail about what's going on, but I think it's important for you to understand park finances and park funding sources at the moment. And also, if you happen to bump into a city council person or the mayor, feel absolutely free to advocate for additional funding, because you all are well aware that there's $70 million of maintenance needs over the next 5 years. So that fortunately we have people from the Parks Foundation helping us with that ask as well. Okay, well, Craig, let's talk about next meeting.
Okay, next meeting, would we like to have in the conversations with Fifth Third, would we like an investment manager to provide a performance review?
Are they next up as far as?
They would be, I believe, yes, they would be next up.
Okay. Yeah, I think that would be good. I want to make sure we tell them up front that, tell them we'd like for them, if they provide the information ahead of time, we will be prepared. So ask them if they could present and have question and answer totaling 15 to 20 minutes. That way we'll let them know for sure how much time they've got.
Okay.
Hopefully by that time, we can bring you up to date too. If there's, I think as well that if there is a project that we would want to tap into our endowment funds for, I would like to establish a process where we get a recommendation from this committee before a final vote is made by the park board. So if we, by the next meeting, have a proposal for a specific project, we put that on the agenda as well. So Craig, is there anything else that we would have on the agenda for the next meeting? We would do, because we won't have a quarterly review.
No, not that I'm aware of. Be pretty light agenda after the
Okay.
presentation. We'll probably have a little bit more clarity of what's coming in. Definitely we'll have a little bit more clarity of what's coming out of council.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and schedule a June meeting with the understanding that we may push it if there's not a whole hell of a lot to go over at that point. The park board meeting is not until June 17. So
I made June 23rd or June 30th. I don't know that week going into the 4th. A lot of people are on vacation.
yeah, so do we want to do it after yeah, let's do it after. Let's plan for after the next part, like the 23rd, if that's possible.
June
And
23rd.
then if a funding, I don't think a funding issue will jump up that quickly. What do you guys look like for June 23rd?
I can do that.
You're on mute, Kevin, but
Open and booked.
hey, perfect. Okay, let's
Mhm.
put down the 23rd and let's plan that at the park board, if that's okay. That
Yes.
way we won't have to do all of this YouTube gyration. Perfect. Well,
Too bad this never really caught on with followers and got a bunch of subscribers start paying us to be on here.
okay. Well,
If
guys, again,
we could do some TikTok videos during.
There we go.
I do appreciate you guys taking the time with this committee. I know it's not an exciting job, but I appreciate the time and the input that you've made. And again, as you go about your daily jobs, if you hear of a potential, I still would like to add another person to this committee. And anybody that you can think of, I would like a diversity candidate, which as I'm looking at this screen at the moment, as long as it's not a white man, I think that, or an old white man, except Craig. If we, and I say old is over 30, you guys, so I'm all of your seniors, so I can say that. But if you think of somebody, keep your eyes open, because I would like to add somebody else. Great. Well, then I will call the meeting adjourned at 4:26 and appreciate your time. Our next park board meeting is a week from Thursday. And we will be, I think it's covered on YouTube as well. So if you get real bored, you can watch that. All right. Thanks,
Greg, will you
guys.
send out an invitation, an Outlook invitation as you have before?
Yes, I'll do that.
Perfect. Thank you very
after
much.
We adjourn.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
See ya.
Good day. Bye. Hey, Kelly, we are
Hey.
off.
I will end the live stream.